a great honor and privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you folks tonight. Dr. Toporek and I were saying that, we have probably enough material for about 5 hours worth of a presentation. So we will try to focus on the key highlights. We are going to be talking a little bit about post-election that we're still in the midst of, but a central part of our presentation will be applying the advocacy competencies. Next slide, please. So I think anytime you focus on advocacy competencies and the work that we do, it is really critical to ground ourselves in what's happening currently. And obviously we are troubled deeply with the double pandemic that's going on in our world. And this is the context in which we are living and working and seeing our clients within the context of. For those who might be visually impaired, I'm going to just briefly describe some of the slides. We have a slide that shows a surgical mask and hand sanitizer to symbolize the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we also have another slide that's looking at, and it says racism is a virus. So it's a poster that looks like a march that was happening. And the other one is a marquee, and the theater is called The World. And I loved this slide when I found it because it says the world is temporarily closed. And I think that is clearly what we're dealing with in so many different areas is the shutdown related to the COVID-19. Next slide, please. So along with our issues related to racism and COVID-19, we're also struggling with a climate crisis in mental health. Dr. Toporek's from California. Those of you who are in your western region of the United States are have been dealing with wildfires. And one of the slides is a picture of a tree and a fire. And then the other one shows that sort of another one of these posters in a protest. There is no planet B. So climate crisis is a critical issue, and our case that we're going to be touching on looks a little bit at climate crisis and how it's impacting a client. Next slide, please. This next slide focuses on the importance of human rights and our economic plight. Certainly with COVID-19, we have lots of people who are dealing with unemployment issues and food insecurity and lots of other things. There's a slide of a gentleman who's obviously down on his luck, and he has a sign on a suitcase that says anything hungry, help. So this basically is looking at the economic plight. And then we have another slide that says, in this house, we believe love is love, Black Lives Matter, science is real, feminism is for everyone, and no human is illegal, and kindness is everything. So I picked that slide because I thought it just captured a lot of different human rights that we're faced with today. Next slide, please. So we're now going to transition into a little bit of our work related to the elections. And Dr. Toporek is going to do a word cloud. We wanted to say just briefly that if you have technological trouble, just hang with it and you'll be able to see how the word cloud is developing. So if it doesn't quite work for you, don't worry about that because you'll get the effect of it anyway. Dr. Toporek, did you want to share? You're on mute.
Somebody was saying we should have t-shirts that say you're on mute.
Yes.
So what we want to do is to have you think about in 1 or 2 words, what impact you think the recent election might have on the communities you work with and live in as a counselor. And the way that you contribute to this poll, for those of you not familiar, you can either use the QR code using your phone there that'll take you to the site, or go to slido.com and enter the event number 28207. And so as you see, some folks are already putting it in. You can put in more than one response. Just be sure that you put them each in separately. We'll give a few minutes.
Before, and so I don't know if there's other people who had never done it before, but as more and more people put in the similar words, those then become bigger on the screen, just in case you've never done this before. So we're seeing lots of different issues arising, significant stress, uncertainty, fear, anxiety. Anxiety is our biggest one. And then lots of other ones around depression, invisibility, pessimism, depression, oppression, equality, anxiety, fear is getting bigger, uncertainty. Certainly we don't yet know the outcome of the presidential election, but it's very clear that we have a country that is very, very divided in terms of where people stand on issues.
It looks like stress is also increasing in size, uncertainty, anxiety. We'll give a few more minutes to folks who haven't been able to put that in yet. I'm noticing there are a couple of things, comfort. Well, actually, maybe comfort's the only one I see. The rest of them seem like they're actually representing anxiety and not just negative feelings, but I'm actually thinking that some of this we may be feeling in our bodies.
And I would suggest that probably some of this is a result of the sort of hanging in the balance feeling that we're in, but also given the way the election is turning out, clearly these are more long-term feelings and experiences that people are having.
I think the other thing that I want to add to that is that I've, over the last few days, talked with a lot of people who, some who are not surprised with what's coming up and feel like that is an indication of the way that they've felt in this country, the oppression that they've felt for some time, and for other people feeling surprised and disappointed because they expected something different. And then I think other folks that may have had some hope that the election would turn out in a particular way that would help allay fears that they had prior, and seeing that that's not happening, and that it's not just a matter of a politician or politicians, but it actually is a representation of how divided the country seems to be in terms of their views about policies, but also really about actions and rhetoric, and how language is being used, and what impact that has on our families, our communities, us as individuals, our profession, the institutions that we work with.
So keep these in mind in terms of our case that we're going to be looking at in the context of what's happening in the election and where our present day issues are residing. Okay, next slide too, if you get a chance. So I think essentially this is giving us a moment to pause and really to think about and to feel all the different feelings that are going on for ourselves. And as Rebecca had mentioned, there were not a lot of really positive feelings per se. There was comfort, but I think where there is crisis, there is also the opportunity for us to take advantage of all sorts of different ways that we can advocate for clients and those that we work with. So, so I think it's important for us to also look at how we as a profession can address these different challenges. We're going to move. I know Dr. Toporek's having a little trouble with that.
I apologize here.
No worries.
So we're going to move.
Yeah, you're not a problem. We're going to move to looking at the history of social justice in our profession. And as I had mentioned before, this is a presentation that I do probably in an hour, and I'm going to condense it down to a very short amount. And so please, bear with me, because I'm just going to touch on some highlights of some different things, but try to give you a flavor for the history of social justice within our profession. And I do this in part because I think it's important that we not only ground ourselves in what is happening currently, which we saw within those slides, and then historically, where have we come from, I think is very important to look at. So historically, in the early 1990s, you had Frank Parsons looking at immigration and vocational counseling issues. You had Clifford Beards. He was looking at mental health services and the humane treatment of people with mental health issues. And as you, again, we don't have time tonight, but as you look through different decades within our history of our country, you can sort of see how the profession has followed those different decades. So we're going to kind of jump forward to the 1970s when AMCD was formated, and actually that was originally called the Association for Non-White Concerns, and that started in the 1970s and by a fellow by the name of Samuel Johnson. And I'd encourage you, if you've not been to the AMCD website, to look at that, that history there, because it's clearly a very telling struggle for social justice and advocacy. So in the 1985s, AMCD came out of this Association for Non-White Concerns and was born. And then if we jump forward to 1990, we have an ACA policy that is 301.7, which I've become intimately familiar with. And this was a policy that essentially was created so that ACA did not take any social justice stands. And it essentially said that they don't deal with issues of social conscience unless there is a consensus around those issues. So I've served now for 9 years on the Governing Council. And for the first several years that I was on the Governing Council, this policy was continually brought up to block any kind of social justice work or motions or policies or different things that I work to try to pass. And so I'm going to kind of weave back to that one in a second. Let's go to the 1992s, where the multicultural competencies were developed. I'm sure you folks are well familiar with that. And I wanted to touch upon one thing, which is that in the early 90s, I had the opportunity to work with a number of multicultural leaders. And one of the initiatives that we started was to make sure that multicultural competencies were integrated into every aspect of what ACA does. And one of those things now, when you go to put in a conference proposal, is you are asked, how will you address cultural competence? And that comes from the early 1990s and the work that I did with that group. And then if we fast forward to the late 90s and early 2000s, you see that President Loretta Bradley had a theme which was centered around advocacy. And this at that point was very controversial and got met with a lot of resistance. During this time was also the formation of CSJ, and I'm a founding board member. So I was intimately involved in the creation of CSJ and all the struggles around trying to get it established. And Dr. Bradley and Dr. Lewis were very instrumental in getting that passed through the ACA Governing Council. And then shortly after that were the development of the advocacy competencies. And it's really an honor to have Dr. Toporek here tonight, because she is one of the folks who helped to create the advocacy competencies. And she is the only living member of the original creators of the advocacy competencies. And she has an incredible wealth of information and history, which we won't have time to get into. But that was very important. And then recently, I think 2018, Dr. Toporek and I have helped to update those advocacy competencies. And we'll show you a slide later about how you can find those. So let me weave back really quickly to policy 301.7 and just say that, again, it was created to not have any sort of advocacy, social justice type work within ACA, even though obviously ACA was doing some different things when a particular issue came up that they didn't want to take any action on or was too controversial, they would waive the policy. So back in 2017, I worked on the Governing Council to revise that, because in reality, we actually have advocacy in our ethics and in a number of our other important organizational documents. And during this time period, I was also able to help create ACA's strategic plan, which has social justice advocacy as one of 3 of the critical pillars to that strategic plan. So that also helped us to do that. We're going to move now into looking at the importance of cultural competence, and Dr. Toporek's going to speak a little bit about that, and then we're going to look at a case.
So thank you, Dr. Daniels, for that history. And one of the things that I recall, and I was really fortunate to also be able to participate in the development of counselors for social justice. And remember, the meetings. It's the only meeting I've ever been at that ended a half a day early because we just got it done. Everybody was on the same page. And one of the things that I think is maybe important and helpful to emphasize here is even the foundation of CSJ was rooted in the importance of cultural competence and values around cultural competence and advocacy. And CSJ came about because the different divisions that focused on justice issues, really oppression, justice, marginalized clients and marginalized counselors, came together to say we have a common thread. Our common thread is around fighting against oppression. And so LGBT, AMCD, ASGW, there were a number of different divisions and people within those divisions that felt very strongly about the importance of social justice and advocacy in the profession, and said, I think we need a place where we can all come together. And so CSJ was born out of that. And then later on, the advocacy competencies also really had at its root the importance of cultural competence. And so as we talk about cultural competence, and we'll do so through a case, as Judy mentioned, to really be thinking about the models, and within counseling, as you know, we rely on really two models. The 2015 model that came from AMCD and the authors there that integrated the 1992 Sue Arredondo McDavis model. And so just in keeping in mind three core areas of focus: counselor attitudes and beliefs, client worldview, culturally relevant interventions. And the 1992 document really focused that each of these three areas included awareness, knowledge, and skill. And then some of the additions that the 2015 model introduced, or rather highlighted and articulated more explicitly, is the importance of understanding oppression, privilege, marginalization, and power of the counselor and the client, as well as intersectionality of identities. And when we look back at the original definitions of intersectionality, looking at that all of us have different identities, and the way identities come together in a complex way is really shaped by aspects of power and privilege. So for example, to be a white woman is very different than to be a Black woman in society's eyes. And so simply to say that those are different identities is not sufficient, but to say that the intersectionality of those identities is really shaped by sociopolitical forces. That model also introduced counseling relationship in a more explicit way, and talking about that as cultural competence. So we want to be sure that as you think about advocacy competencies and advocacy in general, that having the cultural frame is critical in everything that we do. So we'd like to really use a case, and there are a lot of different cases we could use, but we'd like to use this case. And to start, what I'm going to do is to read the case to you, and then I'd like for you to think about the issues that you see in this scenario. As I read the case, if you can just jot down some ideas on the paper. We're going to do another word cloud, but I'd like to give you a chance to actually look at the case first. So Roberto, your client, lives with his two children, his brother's family, and his grandmother in a 2-bedroom apartment. He's working in a restaurant and is concerned about his supervisor and many of the customers who don't believe in wearing masks. In light of the uncertain outcome of the election, this tension has increased as they have different perspectives about that. His grandmother has a compromised immune system. His two children are sharing their computer with their other cousin who also lives in the home. And consequently, on any day, the kids have to miss part of the lesson because they don't have access to the computer. Roberto is concerned because one of the teachers has said he needs to be more available because his child is missing too much school. Tensions have been high in the apartment because there's been police violence and air quality issues in the neighborhood, and thus the family stays in the apartment most of the time. So if you'll take a minute and think about and jot down on a piece of paper, what are some of the issues that you see in this scenario? Now what I'd like for you to do is to use this word cloud. It's a new QR code and a new event code. So you'll want to log into slido.com, use event code number 96742. And if you could type in, what issues do you see in this scenario?
So we've got some big ones: technology access, fear, health and safety. Technology is coming out as a big prominent one. Climate issues, extended family, health and safety, critical. See things around respect, lack of resources, accessibility, working conditions. Living conditions is starting to move into a bigger space, as well as lack of resources. Possibly cultural competence, financial issues. I think violence in the neighborhood has to do with health and safety. Police violence. Inequity is moving up in size. And I think, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Judy.
Well, I was just going to say, in any case that any client situation that we're dealing with, you know, this is just a great example of how many different types of issues folks are dealing with, particularly with the pandemic and all the different things that are happening with racism and the environment and all those different things. It's why we focused on some of those beginning slides, is just to sort of always be able to go back to the context of what is currently happening and how that's impacting clients and families.
We also see the smaller words around the bigger words, bringing up issues that maybe sort of underlie some of this: respect, disparities, misunderstood. So some of the emotions that might be behind what the family Roberto might be experiencing. I also suspect those might be some of the things that counselors might be feeling as well.
Some of the smaller ones can fit under some of these larger ones too. So unless you use the exact same word, it won't necessarily come up as a big, a big item too.
Yeah. So we'd like to move now and have you start thinking about advocacy and thinking about this case. And in the chat, what we'd like for you to do is to share some ideas, particularly in terms of how might a counselor advocate in partnership with Roberto and his family. So in other words, as a team, you and Roberto, how might advocacy come into play in the work that the two of you do together?
So if you can just text chat it into the text chat, that would be helpful. And then we can kind of see where people are at with that. And this is one of the key components of the advocacy model. So as we're going through it, keep that in mind. So computers for all children.
So advocating for his kids' needs at school.
Communicating with the teacher. And even a broader context with the school, perhaps the school counselor.
Making sure that Roberto is the one defining what his biggest issues are rather than having the counselor define that.
That's critical. Advocating for health and safety in the work environment. If there's a reunion, that's a good point.
Identifying neighborhood-based advocacy organizations that Roberto can partner with, and even the counselor could partner with.
Then local public health department, looking at the health issues.
Housing agency.
Support systems within the community.
Great. These are wonderful. Now I'm going to take it one more step here. Training of police officers. All right, so now let's continue to look at this case, and we're going to ask you a different advocacy question, which is, how might a counselor, how might you advocate on behalf of Roberto and his family? In what sorts of situations might you as the counselor actually take advocacy action on behalf of Roberto?
And so as we're going to shift to the model in a minute, it's with the client and then on behalf of a client are two key critical contexts here. So yes, so on behalf.
And if you could type that into the chat also. So one of the things to think about as you're thinking about advocacy on behalf of is in what situations might you be in a better position or have access that Roberto may not have, or be free of some of the risks that Roberto might have in terms of advocating.
So I see things policy, which is really important.
Thinking about what privileges we have as counselors and how that actually provides us access in ways that our clients may not have access.
Contacting the school counselor, that's a good one. Working with the school counselor. Knowledge of community resources is key.
Potentially, if language or translation is an issue, interpretation is an issue, then the counselor potentially helping to locate access to interpreters.
I also see here working with local legislators about policy changes.
Mm-hmm. And de-escalation training. And I'm not sure if this is referring to when working with police or not, or just in general. Right. Meeting with community leaders, all sorts of community leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, excellent. All right, wonderful ideas. And so what we'd like to do now is to go ahead and shift over to talking a little bit about the advocacy competencies. And one of the things we weren't quite sure about is how familiar folks were going to be with this model. So for some of you, you may already be familiar, and so please bear with us. For others, may not. And again, in an effort to try to make the visual verbal, I'm going to try to talk through the model and talk about some of the key points. And what we'd also like to do is, as we do this, is to bring out and talk about some of the ideas that came out in chat and what domains they might represent, because we had such a beautiful array of ideas from all of you that really can illustrate some of the ways that these domains can come to life. So the advocacy competency model was developed with really two primary dimensions. You can see on the left side is a two-directional arrow talking about extent of client involvement. And so on one side of the advocacy model is collaboration with the client. So that's advocacy that's taken in partnership with the client. There's other types of advocacy that's taken on behalf of the client. And again, you all provided really great illustrations about those two different ends of the continuum. And on the right side, there's a bidirectional arrow that is related to extent of client involvement, but that really talks about the focus of counselor energy. So if we're doing advocacy and collaboration with the client, then our focus as counselors is going to be to support the client and client groups, to facilitate and provide support to them in the advocacy that they are taking. Whereas if we're advocating on behalf of clients, then the focus of our energy will be on direct system intervention. Along the bottom is a bidirectional arrow and shows going from the left to the right in the model, micro level advocacy interventions to macro level advocacy interventions. And so on the micro level advocacy intervention, that's individuals working with the individual or student client. That would be working with Roberto directly. In the middle is working with the community, school, and organization. And so that's where we might be working with community groups or advocacy within particular systems. And then on the far right side at the macro level is working within the public arena. And so in collaboration with would be doing collective action, and then and behalf of would be social political advocacy. And now I'd just like to talk for a few minutes about each individual domain. So at the individual student client level, advocacy that's in collaboration with the client is client student empowerment. And there were a lot of examples in the chat about that, working with Roberto to talk about how to advocate for his children with the teachers. Some ideas about helping Roberto kind of formulate his thoughts about approaching his supervisor or how to deal with the workplace. And so what might be some strategies, some ways that he could talk with his boss about that. And I want to go back to one of the really important points that someone brought in too, is really helping facilitate Roberto in defining where does he want to impact change right now. He's got so many different issues. And so in terms of thinking about the empowerment, where would he like to focus his energy? While at the same time, you as a counselor may be thinking about, okay, this is Roberto's situation. There may be some other folks, some other ways that I can assist as well. So at the individual student client level, when we're advocating on behalf of, that domain is called client student advocacy. And that may be where we, in our position, intervene within a system or intervene in a barrier on behalf of Roberto. So there could be a couple of different examples. One that came up as well is that we talk directly to the teacher, or we might talk directly to the school, or we may know or have connections with tech companies or other places where we might be able to advocate for services or materials or things like that that could be donated to the school or to the client. And so in this case, and one of the things that I think distinguishes really when it is collaboration with or when it is on behalf of, at times the client may feel like the cost to them for advocating is too great. And so in that case, we may advocate on their behalf in a way that doesn't put the client at risk. Another time when we might advocate for them is when there may be communication barriers, when the client doesn't feel comfortable with their language abilities to communicate or advocate for themselves. And so we may facilitate advocacy on behalf of the client there. When we looked at the community school level or organizational level, community collaboration, some of the ideas that came up were about joining, finding other community organizations that Roberto may be able to partner with or become a part of. And we as a counselor, our role in that is not just helping Roberto to find those groups, but then also taking a look at how can we facilitate that group? What knowledge, what skills can we offer to facilitate the community in identifying some advocacy actions they may want to take? And we may not be the driver. In fact, for none of the advocacy domains where we're collaborating with, we are not the driver of the advocacy. We are a facilitator. We are supporting, we're bringing whatever knowledge we have. And we may be only one of a number of different professionals that come into play there. So whether it's around employment, tenant rights, schools, there are all kinds of different organizations, advocacy organizations, that are already in play. And one of the important things about that is they have skill, knowledge, and a force already put together. And so how we and Roberto may tap into that to address some of his concerns. Systems advocacy is at the school community level, organizational level, where we're advocating on behalf of. And so that's, again, similar to the ideas that were brought up in terms of perhaps advocating at the school advocating in the employment situation. The difference between this and client-student advocacy is that we're looking at a group of clients or a group of community members who may be experiencing similar things. And so with systems advocacy, we may be looking at how do we intervene at different systems within the community that are actually impacting Roberto and others like Roberto. So for example, I'm sure that Roberto's family is not the only family experiencing this resource issue within the schools. And so the system advocacy is also really helpful to de-identify the client who might be feeling that they're at risk. For example, the employment situation. You know, Roberto may be concerned that this could impact his employment if he raises issues with his employer. However, if we do systems advocacy on behalf of, let's say, restaurant workers in the area, to start to take a look at, are there organizations in the area that can address these kinds of issues in terms of safety in the workplace and employment stability and other things like that. Roberto may not feel comfortable being involved in that, particularly for clients who have precarious positions in relation to systems, like in relation to police, in relation to schools, in relation to ICE. That systems advocacy that we get involved with, we may not be in as vulnerable a position as Roberto or others like Roberto in terms of raising these issues. Some of the other issues and the public arena domain, we won't go into in great detail because, as was mentioned before, there is another webinar that's scheduled to specifically focus on social and political advocacy. But we will say that there are a couple of things when we look at the public arena, that's really looking at the macro level. So that might be citywide, that might be statewide, that might be nationally or even internationally, and looking at collective action that could take place. There may be advocacy groups already happening that are working on legislation at the state level, that are working with the city council for different things. I know in terms of health and safety, that's often Department of Health within a city. And so there may be collective action that can take place there, as well as the social and political advocacy. So we'd like to move ahead and talk about, you know, we've talked about Roberto, we've talked about his case, and I think there are a lot of implicit things that are related to his case that are really important and related in many direct and indirect ways to the election that's just happened. And some of the issues or the impact that folks put in the word cloud in terms of the results of the election really indicate sort of the tension, the fear, the sense of anxiety, and those kinds of things. And I think some of the things that I've heard from people this week and last week have been hoping that the election would sort of resolve some of these longstanding tensions that people have been feeling. And as the results are coming in, they're not seeing any relief on that. So we thought we might just bring in a little bit of discussion about where would we look at some of the places where the election may, either this time or a little bit further down the road as we look at future elections. So, and Judy, I don't remember whether it's you or I that's going to talk about this. We can either jump in. I'm getting so distracted by some of the chat. There's so much exciting chat going on.
Good stuff. No, you know, I think as we're looking at post-election things, some of the things that we looked at in the public arena section of the model are going to be really critical, working with school boards, health boards, sheriff. Some of these are different depending on your community and how those different offices work, but the district attorney, the mayor, all these different sort of systems can have a tremendous amount of influence over what's happening within your state and within your city. And then there's also like propositions that go on the ballot, could be related to affirmative action or propositions related to environmental issues. Lots of different types of things can emerge that are clearly impacting our clients and their families. And so it's really important for us to always, you know, sort of as we come around the corner towards the near end of this presentation, look at what the context is currently, look at what our city, state, and national contexts are in terms of elections and those different issues on those boards and propositions and stuff, and also focus in on then how all of those impact individual clients that we serve. So I think it's a complex system, and I think one of the neat things about the advocacy competencies is that it does give us an opportunity to look on lots of different levels in very complex ways to be able to figure out how best we can serve with and on behalf of our clients.
And, you know, when we go back to thinking about, you know, I know this is, for me, I'll be very transparent. This is the first time that I've been so aware about how important the local elections have been in terms of school boards deciding on materials that go into school, but also deciding on police presence in the school, the health boards in our community, and how they have an impact on not just the immediate decisions within the hospitals, but also how the community responds to the health crisis. Certainly the sheriff, DA, mayoral, dealing with the police presence and the increased militarization. I live very close to Oakland, California, and just the response and how the sheriff deals with or doesn't deal with increased militarization of police has been really important. And that is an elected position in my community. So now post-election, as I see the results starting to come in, is, okay, so the voting is passed and who was elected. And so now how do I support those members that have been elected that actually can advocate for the issues that my clients care about and who are aligned with that? How can I help support them and provide information as a counselor to them about some of these reality situations, so they then have the material that they can use to argue the case for our clients and our communities? And then how do I also identify those folks who are elected who do not? Maybe they don't understand. Maybe I can give them the benefit of the doubt and say they don't understand. And if we provide them with some information about how critical this is, perhaps some of them may actually listen. Some of them may not. And so what I really need to do is to apply pressure to them as a voting member to be very clear about how we are watching, and what impact this has, and that we care on that.
The other thing I wanted to mention too, I know in December you have the ACA legislative person coming to do a presentation, and ACA I think does a very good job of working with legislative issues nationally, and as well as to some degree on the state level. And they're always talking about the importance of personal stories. So I think the stories from our clients and helping people to truly understand what those issues are sort of brings to life the real life struggles that people are having and how these different elected officials are impacting that, because I think sometimes they lose sight of some of those pieces, and it's that human story that's so critical.
And I see one of the comments in the chat saying all politics are local, and I absolutely agree. And even more, there have been even more examples really recently, at least in our communities, about the impact the federal government has had on our local politics and back and forth. And maybe that's always been the case, and it's just so much more clear to me now. But I think that there are ways that the national politics play out at the local level, and I think ways that the local level supports basically the policies that can be so harmful to our clients and communities, and often are the people who are most visible to our clients and community in terms of the immediate impact of their daily life in there. So we wanted to show you, because there was another comment in the chat, and I'm not exactly sure if this is what they were referring to, but one of the things about, so the comment was about legality of systems groups that we may have the opportunity to collaborate with. One of the things that it made me think about, and this may not be related to the chat, but it did spur an idea for me, which is a question that comes up often in talking about advocacy with my students is, well, I'm not trained in doing X, Y, or Z. And so knowing our scope of competence is absolutely important. In terms of providing legal advice to our clients, that is not our role. But it is our role to collaborate and partner and have relationships with people that do have the expertise. In addition, though, there is stuff that we know. And one of the things that the advocacy competencies really tries to identify is within each of those domains, what are some skills that we ought to have in order to provide advocacy? And those skills, those strategies are really within the bounds of counseling. And so one of the things that I encourage you to do is to take a look again at the advocacy competencies. We're constantly in the process, Judy and I, of thinking what's missing there, what needs to be added. And we are working on a project that's going to illustrate them in much greater detail, and we'll be sure to let CSJ know when that comes to fruition. But to take a look at the ACA website, if you go to the competencies section under the Knowledge Center, the ACA Advocacy Competencies is the first document that's listed there. And so it goes into a bit of detail. And again, hopefully within the next year, there'll be another big set of resources that are available talking about advocacy. So we wanted to be sure to leave time for questions and answers. And I think we can have the questions come into the chat. That might be the easiest thing to do. I don't see that there's anything in Q&A, and I'm just looking to make sure if I can see hands raised or not. I see. Okay, so either hands raised or in the chat. Any questions? There's really vibrant conversation in the chat before. Are there things we've got really about 7 or 8 minutes or so that we can spend and dive in a little deeper into some areas or talk about things that we might have missed.
So these could be questions specifically about the model or the case or another situation that you have in mind in terms of how to address it from an advocacy perspective.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, I will say that one of the things that is important to address, I think, when counselors are involved in advocacy is that we may be in situations where people don't like us very much. If we're confronting systems that are oppressive systems, when we're bringing to light oppressive situations, and I'm going to speak right now as a white person advocating around issues of racism, that there are plenty of white people that do not like me for doing that. And of course, that's perfectly fine with me, but it also is something that we need to think about in terms of what risks are we able to make, and to be realistic about that. Someone not liking me, yeah, that's a risk, but that's not really the same kind of risk as my Black colleague who may be doing the same kind of thing. The consequences for them are going to be much different than the consequences for me. And so to be realistic about what costs, and also to think through perhaps with colleagues about if we take certain specific actions and the strategies, we may want to think about the consequences and which strategies may be the best benefit with the least amount of cost. It's also really important to think about the impact on the client or the community. If we advocate in a certain way, to be sure that that's aligned with what the community wants and what the community needs, and that it's not going to be something that actually puts the community in more danger. There's a comment about, seems like advocacy is very individualized from a counseling standpoint. point, are there local groups in which counselors collectively advocate for people? If I'm interpreting this correctly, and April, if I'm not, maybe you can raise your hand and say it more directly. I think Counselors for Social Justice is certainly one of those. ACA also does that. There are also groups of mental health providers. So often it's not just counselors, but yes, NAMI. And NAMI is a great example of collaborative advocacy. So those are folks that experience mental illness, as well as folks who provide services for mental illness. I work a lot with homelessness. And so in San Francisco, there's the Coalition for Homelessness. And so that's a community organization made up of a lot of different people. I think that one of the things that's important is that advocacy is stronger when we collaborate with different types of people, that groups of counselors in and of themselves are not necessarily the best collective group to be advocating, because there are skills that are needed, skills and knowledge that are needed across disciplines. And so if we can collaborate across disciplines, that will be stronger, unless we're collaborating, advocating on something that's very specific to counseling.
I wanted to also mention that ACA has a Human Rights Committee. I've been on that for 7 years now, and we do a lot of different advocacy initiatives around different human rights issues within the counseling profession. And it kind of fits with Danny's comment, which is recommending what we can do as graduate students. There's lots of different things graduate students can be involved with. One is the Human Rights Committee. You can get on the Human Rights Committee and be appointed to that committee. And then there's lots of other things in terms of advocacy, again, in relation to CSJ. Both of our two hosts here, Rebecca and I forgot your name, no. But anyway,
Laura. Yeah.
Laura, that's it. I wasn't remembering if this was Laura or Lisa. They're doing a tremendous amount of advocacy and training within CSJ. So there's lots of different opportunities for students. And there's the national level, and then there's your local level as well.
And I want to go back to April's question about advocacy being individualized. I think that the middle section of the model, as well as the collective action, is a really important aspect. We talked about it in terms of a counselor working with Roberto, but I think one of the really important things for us to do as individual counselors is to make relationships with those collaborative groups, and that is a part of advocacy. And so when we do that, I think different situations come up that we have the knowledge about who's working on this, who else is out there, because certainly rebuilding the wheel doesn't make sense here. There are a lot of people that have a lot of knowledge, whether it's lived experience or whether it is disciplinary knowledge. So, and I see we're coming to the end. We just have one more minute.
So there was another question about school counselor addressing threats of alienating students raised in racist households and advocating for others. I'll just give my perspective on this. I think anytime you advocate for one group of people, you have the opportunity, or whatever, it wouldn't be an opportunity, but of alienating other folks. And so I think that's just part of what makes it difficult for as far as being an advocate and being sort of the voice of the voiceless, that other folks may not appreciate that.
I also want to acknowledge that right now we're in a very difficult time because people are communicating in their homes. And so I know one of the things that my students are experiencing as counselors is that they're providing counseling to students and clients who are in an unfriendly environment. They're in their home and there may be hostility around sexual orientation, around all kinds of different things. And so the clients don't feel free to talk about the issues that they're having because of the home. And I just want to acknowledge that that's a very difficult thing right now. And I know we're at time. I could just talk and talk and talk and talk about this. I'm so pleased that all of you have joined us tonight, and for the work that you're doing in your communities. I see all the names, and I know a lot of you are advocates and longtime advocates and have done tremendous work. And I want to thank you all for doing that. It's so critical, and we need everybody.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to present. And, you know, both Dr. Toporek and I are more than happy to answer questions offline as well. So thank you for coming tonight to this presentation and for embracing the importance of advocacy.
Thank you all for being with us tonight. Thank you again to Drs. Daniels and Toporek. Clearly, based on the chat, people are loving what they have heard and are feeling encouraged. So thank you again for all the work you have done. Laura has put in the chat a few times, and we'll again, the link for that 1-hour CE certificate. We also have on the screen the upcoming webinar that will be December 3rd with Dominique. That will look more at that macro level that was talked about a little bit tonight. So please go ahead and make sure you have that link to the webinar. And then once you have that, we invite you to exit the call, and we'll see you in December so our team can stay on and have a debrief. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.